Okay, I'll do an introduction. I'd like to welcome everybody to this episode of Grail Country with Martin Shaw and myself. Um, I went to see Martin in Duncan and really enjoyed his presentation, his storytelling, the stories themselves. But I was also impressed with the reception of these stories and the spirit that I felt in the room. And I also wanted to talk to Martin about that. So we're just going to see where this conversation goes. I think Martin is a bit of a wild man, and I'm myself a little bit of a wild woman. So we'll see what happens next. Okay, well, what I wanted to start with, Martin, was a quote from Meister Eckhart that I love, and you might be familiar with it. "You will not find me in the usual places. Come to the desert if you'd like to see. Look where you might become lost for a while. There is a wide wilderness in me." I did read your book, Courting the Wild Twin, by the way. And I loved it. I got it on Audible and I listened to it like 3 times because the story was great, but a lot of the preamble felt really personal to me. Like I kind of understood exactly, like I felt like I was standing there in that place. And I have been living off the land my husband and I, since 1997. We raised our 3 kids in the bush and have homesteaded ever since then. And at that same point in time, I stopped going to church for one was practical reasons. There wasn't really a church nearby. And but one was I was just kind of done with all the propositional language and things of that nature. And I really felt like what Meister Eckhart says there, come to the desert if you'd like to see. I felt like I went into a desert, and it wasn't a desert of loneliness, but it was a desert of aloneness. And I think those are 2 different things. And I mean, if I'm just honest and plain about it, I felt like God had me by the hand, and he was just treating me like a small child and showing me things, little things, within nature, you know. And one of the ways that I think about it is I started to see the shape of things. You know, a tree was no longer just a tree, like a propositional tree. This is a biological entity, and it has sap, and it does this, but it had a shape, and that shape was pointing me to something transcendent. You know, everything started to take on a shape. I don't know how else to explain it. And I know that you do wilderness vigils, and I've never done that. I feel like I've been on one, but I wasn't fasting, you know? But I'm trying to think of what it is exactly I'm trying to get at here. I guess the question is, can you make a connection between the Meister Eckhart quote and the idea of courting your wild twin in a Christian context? Is that a possibility?
Yeah. I mean, let's go back in my imagination. I'm going to go back to about 1978.
Okay.
And I would be, 6 or something, or 7. And I'm sitting at Upton Vale Baptist Church in Torquay. It's warm. The sermon is floating on and on and on. It's a good sermon. I can tell that it's having remarkable results for people that are, 3 or 4 decades older than me.
Yeah.
But my fantasy is of Aslan smashing through the window, grabbing the preacher by the scruff of the neck, not killing them, not killing them,
just giving him a good shake.
just moving us into the wondrous a bit, because I grew up with a kind of Christianity, to be honest, that I associated with structures that were built by humans. The heating's usually a bit too hot, breathless proximity to domesticity. But then in the middle of this, there's this disconnect, because the Druid, in which all this is centered, is saying the wildest things I've ever heard anybody say. They're so derailing, they're so countercultural, they're so challenging, they're so mystical, they're so strange. And yet, in the last 2,000 years, we've managed to build up, not all the time, but sometimes things around it that seem in direct aesthetic disconnect with what is actually being preached or read. And so, like you, I went walkabout for 50 years. I really did. I knew I had a spiritual soul. I knew I had a mystical heart, but I knew that I wasn't going to be fed in these particular institutions. Yeah. Certainly not at that time. So I completely understand the Eckhart quote. I can feel from you immediately a great sort of kinship of experience where we just want to fall into the mind of Christ. Of course we do. It's the most natural thing in the world. And at the same time, a lot of the paraphernalia that is built around any kind of church, no one is innocent of this, whether it's east, west, up, down, whatever. Yeah. As soon as human beings are getting involved, as soon as the mosh pit of humans starts descending on the incredibly high bar that Christ sets us, it's always going to be a bit of a mess. I've been saying recently that a network is not the same as a community. And one of the things about obviously living almost living online these days, a lot of us, we have the luxury of networks where we keep bumping into people who, by and large, we feel and think the same things. And I think actually one of the things that is healthy about a church is that a church is going to have a village idiot in it. You may be that village idiot, but you're going to bump into the Trump supporters. You're going to bump into the life is a contact sport, and you're going to bump into all sorts of things that really rub you up the wrong way. I'm going through this at the moment because although I sort of drifted around after realizing I was a Christian, I didn't really become one. This dreadful dawning realization that everything I really loved is in the Beatitudes. That's kind of it.
Yeah. Okay.
But now, of course, you can float from one experience to another, but the rubber really hits the road when there's 15 other people saying things that you don't chime with in a small group, trying to make it work. I'm in a small congregation. Some are Russian, some are Ukraine. Imagine that going on.
Yeah. That's
fascinating stuff.
A great testing ground.
How do we live with suffering? How do we come together with suffering? What does the liturgy have to say about that? So anyway, I didn't know, certainly, orthodoxy in England is very, very low key. They haven't exactly got what you would call a kind of Billy Graham mission statement, which is part of the attraction for me.
Yeah.
But it also
just to interrupt quickly, I don't know if you realize it, but I'm also an Orthodox Christian. I was baptized last Pentecost.
Oh, really?
Not this Pentecost, but the Pentecost before. Yeah,
like a year ago.
Yes, a year ago.
How's that been for you?
Oh, it's been amazing. Honestly, I never thought I would ever join another church.
Yeah.
I really didn't. I had so much communion in my wilderness, right, experience with God that I just kept asking. I kept saying, are we done yet? Like, do I have to go back to church? Because I felt like at some point he was going to ask me to do something I didn't want to do, and then I heard, honestly, I never knew anything about Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox Church. I had no idea it even existed. I'd heard about Coptic Christians. I'd heard about Syrian Christians, but I never knew what they were, Anyway, and then I ran into the church fathers and I started reading and I was like, basically for me, I felt like they were describing the world I lived in. It was a cosmic Christianity, right? And the dome overhead was the same one that I had over my head. It was the stars, right? And the Lord of the stars. And like I never abandoned God. The contrary, my faith was deepened and my relationship was deepened through those years. And so I got the nudge one day, and I thought, I was very fearful. I was fearful to do it. It took me a couple of years to actually make that commitment, and then I did. And I'm very glad I did, actually.
It's amazing. I love to hear that. And my question, I guess, one of several wonderings would be, how does your wild self, how is that accommodated by orthodoxy? Because you can see from a distance, I was talking about it to someone, I said, from a distance, it looks rather like orthodoxy is kind of just covered in dust and men with beards chanting, and not the most feminine of enterprises. And then you get in within it, and it's as you say, you look up and expect to see a roof, and you see 100,000 stars. Mm-hmm. How is it for you? Are there points of tension?
No, not yet. I mean, I don't agree with everything that people in the church say, but that's to be expected. I don't agree with everything my husband says, So, like I've always had a very intimate relationship with animals, for example. And, my family, my intimate family calls me Dr. Doolittle because they say I could talk to them. And I, here I am discovering all these saints, who have these wild companions. And I've experienced that, literally, I have. And so, I can't say, like I've said to some people, I feel like I didn't have to give up anything when I moved from the natural world into the supernatural world. Like there was it was just a simple transition. I don't think that it's any different. And the enchantment that I experience in the natural world was confirmed for me in the church. Like, I'm like, is this really this magical? Is this really right? And are the stars really telling me this? Does the tree really represent that? And then I move it to the church and it's all there, and I'm like, oh, it does. And yes. And oh, God told me that. And he also told these people that, and so it confirmed my own journey, to be honest with you. It was like, I wasn't making this up in my head. The Holy Spirit was actually teaching me. And I found all those, it's like he said, okay, Shari, I want to show you, I want you to meet some other people that I taught these things to. And there they are, I can't think of any concrete examples at the moment, but I think you get what I'm talking about. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I felt home. I actually, I was received as a catechumen on a Zoom call because it was during COVID. And where I live, there is no Orthodox church near me. So the nearest one is 5 hours away. And I actually was on the Zoom liturgies and so on for a year with a church on Vancouver Island. Mm. And I had never met any of those people. And when I went to your venue, I went to the church for the first time. And I met everyone in person. And I might get emotional because when I walked into the church and stood there amongst the icons, I immediately wept. because it was there. It wasn't just on a screen.
Mm.
Sorry.
No. Yeah. No, I know that feeling. I know that feeling. When I was younger, one of the most powerful parts of my early Christian life was the early 80s, when the sort of the phenomenon of the charismatic movement was really sort of sweeping through a lot of rather staid English evangelical and Anglican circles.
Yeah.
And so suddenly I had these experiences of being sort of pulled out of a church service where you knew exactly what was going to happen into an encounter where you had almost no idea what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, the high drama of people being healed, speaking in tongues, all of that stuff was going on. There was also something a little precarious about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it sometimes felt that there was a bit of leakage. It didn't have what I always look for. In medieval alchemy, there's a phrase I love, vas bene clausum, the well-sealed vessel.
Oh.
The charismatic movement, almost by default, didn't always seem to be a well-sealed vessel.
Mm-hmm.
And then I forgot about it. And then, 30 years later, I'm walking through a shopping mall in England, and I come to an old Anglican church, an Anglo-Saxon church that they can't knock down because it's such a historical building, but it's surrounded by shops selling, tobacco and porn and the rest of it.
No.
I wander in and enter the divine liturgy. And I've described that moment before, so I won't do it here. But the bit that I think is useful and you might chime with is within that hour and a half or 2 hours of the liturgy, I experienced again the perfume of the Holy Spirit. Mm. But this time it had this phenomenal runway in which to land.
That's a good point.
It wasn't just sort of moving scattergun around the room.
Right.
It had something that had been ground in the hearts and minds of people for, AD 33 or something like it.
Right.
So there was this tremendous sense of weight that coincided beautifully and anchored this particular. It's like a taste. I can taste it. I can smell it. I know what it is. I know when spirit has arrived. But I'd never seen such an incredible landing device for it. And
right.
not once in that service did anyone turn around and saying, "How are you doing, Martin? And do you want a donut? And, are you tired? How's Jesus working in your..." None of that stuff happened. But the little me got subsumed into the big story.
Right.
It was immensely personal in an incredibly mythological type of way.
Yes.
And for the first time, I glimpsed, my Christianity had already sifted to consciousness by this point, but there was something about the Orthodox Church that is not really like anything I've come across before. It's not necessarily for me the easiest fit, but that's not the point.
Right.
Joe Campbell says we all gag on true doctrine. Mm-hmm. At one point or another, you're going to come across something and you go, this just doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah.
And you can try it out. I'm noticing at the moment that a lot of the things a year ago I thought were absolute lunacy, I now see as profound wisdom. But I didn't know until I tried.
Right.
So very humbling for me. But it's really moving for me to hear about your journey. And also, I remember meeting you a couple of weeks ago in was it Duncan?
Yeah, it was at Duncan.
And it was that, do you remember it was that packed hall, almost breathlessly packed?
Yes.
It was warm. A lot had gone wrong in the lead up to it. There was all sorts of problems there was all sorts of things going wrong. And when I'm preparing to go on, I always pray. And I always pray the same thing. I pray that the God of the story defeats me. That I'm defeated by the God that lives within the story. And the God that lives within the story for me is the Nazarene Druid. It's Yeshua.
Oh, yes.
Because I'm as befuddled as anybody and I'm as filled with ambition and nervousness and pride as anyone else. And actually 80% of the business of being an efficient carrier of story is just negotiating that and being able to bear standing on stage for 2 hours while lots of people form very definite opinions about you. And you just have to put all of that away. So it was nice to meet you. I remember I hadn't even got to the dressing room when you popped up.
I know. I thought you were going to disappear.
Yeah, well, I do disappear. I'm not fed by the afterglow.
No, yeah.
It's not healthy for me.
Right.
So I have to vamoose at that point and drink Guinness and watch mixed martial arts and just completely do something else.
Yeah, disengage. Yeah.
But I like you. I mean, the whole tour was improvised. There was no plan. There was no plan at all. No nights where I thought I'll do this, that, and the other. But I like you, the reception from Nova Scotia to Vancouver and all the points in between. It was just gorgeous. And it's really stayed with me. The readiness and receptivity of a lot of people and a lot of younger folk as well that are absolutely hungry.
Thirsty.
I mean, you and I, and I'm sure many people watching will have talked about the God-shaped hole or the meaning-shaped hole, and I throw in the myth-shaped hole because they're all the same to me.
To me too. Yeah. And I brought with me a woman who probably would never have attended such a venue had I not brought her. And it was all rather spontaneous because I was planning to go and get a hotel, and I called her because I knew her and she lived nearby. Told her I was coming, and then she immediately said, "Oh, you have to stay with me." And then I said, "Well, I got 2 tickets. I bought 2 if you want to come." And she said, "Oh, I'll go," And then she just kept ruminating on that story about the 3 daughters and the dragons and tongues, which, as have I. And but she was also just so impressed at the reception, like myself, and her and I talked about it afterwards. And I said to her, the scriptures are a story. That's what they are. They're a giant supernatural mythological tale. And why are we not telling stories? Like, why, how do I put this? I said to her, church has always been a campfire and stories for millennia for human beings. That's sacred stories have been church. And I don't think Christianity is any different, to be honest. But we have done what Michael Martin likes to call, murdering something to dissect it, right? With this story. And it seems to me that at this point in time, people they want that story again. They want the myth, and myth is not an untrue story. It's a more true story. Yeah. And that's what I saw. That's what I saw at the venue.
Yeah. Well, that was, mercifully, that was what you would have seen for 3 weeks. That's all you would have seen. It's just endless variants of that. I met thousands of people, not dozens, thousands of people on that trip. The strangest thing happened when I got back from it. I got into bed. The tour was over, and for about 5 or 6 nights, every single night, all night, I would then be in another venue doing another evening, completely different to the one before and the one before. Mm-hmm. I found myself in a hospital. I found myself in a Greek temple. I found myself in a Hebridean chapel. I found myself in a Lakota casino. And then finally, I was in places that were just in the underworld, and they were full of people that were suffering. Right. And I just remember the crackle of electricity and faces coming in and out of the dark. It was very tough. But it was as if by that point, by 20 or 21 nights in a row, give or take 1 or 2 nights off, my imagination at 7 o'clock in the evening said, right, okay, strap yourself in. Here we
Right,
go.
right. Time to go.
And that's just ended. It's just ended. Funnily enough, in 48 hours, I'll be gone again. I'll be with Jonathan Peugeot and in Cambridge, and then with him and Kingsnorth in Dublin, and then off to Patmos in terms of visionary experiences, back to the cave of John of the Apocalypse.
Oh, wow.
But it's left me very thoughtful, the Canadian experience, and filled with thoughts about how do we empower. It's a bit of an overused word, but I mean it most sincerely. How do we empower small communities across North America to take this stuff seriously enough? Because Sam, how would it be if you told the myth of Samson as a myth?
Yeah.
How would it be if you decided you were going to look at a fairy tale through the lens of, a figure from scripture? How would it be if Mark, the gospel, the immediacy of Mark combined with a fairy tale? You see, a lot of Christians regard me as a warmed over pagan. They really do. And if they had any understanding of the degree of sacrifice I've had to go through in the last 2 years, they wouldn't think that.
No,
they wouldn't think that. But funnily enough, there's a line, C.S. Lewis once, who was always getting accused of exactly that by evangelicals. Someone said to him, a Christian said to him, Lewis, aren't you worried that we're all becoming pagan? And Lewis, with a devilish grin, smiled and said, oh, bright vision. Because Lewis always felt we had to become pagans before we became Christians again.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. Like, this is why I see a relationship to my experience in the courting the wild twin. Because to me, I felt like that's what was happening in the wilderness, was that I was courting that wild twin. And that wild twin was deeply Christian, right?
Yeah.
And I had to, like you mentioned at the beginning, you had a vision of Aslan breaking through a stained glass window and shaking up the congregation. Well, that is in a sense that wild twin, right? And Meister Eckhart says, there is a wide wilderness in me. And there is something wild and unpredictable about God. And for me personally, when people try to order it, I immediately, all my red flags go up, right? Because that's what we do. We domesticate things, right? So that they serve our purposes. That's why we domesticate them. I'm a farmer. I have horses. I have sheep. I've had goats. I've had cows. You don't want to wander out into the field and try to handle a wild animal. You want to domesticate it so that it serves your purposes. And it seems that that's what Christianity has been doing or attempting to do with God. And I suppose, going back to the idea of being a part of the Orthodox Church, one of the things that I love about it is that nobody's telling me what to think. I don't go to church to think or to rationalize God. I go to church to worship him. Right. Yeah. And that's, I'm happy with that. I'm very happy with that. And afterwards, during coffee hour, we can all argue about the God of our understanding, right? But I don't have anyone in any particular authority telling me that, laying it all out, dissecting it, and pinning it down kind of thing. Yeah. So I don't know. Did you see that relationship when, I know that you wrote Courting the Wild Twin before you were a Christian, but do you see that relationship? Like, do you think I have that wrong, or what do you think?
No, I mean, all the books are filled with what I would call, I'm 17 books in now. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of books, but I would say they're all equipped. And I don't mean this in a vain way. They've all got little pinpricks of the eternal in them.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like a salmon trying to move towards God in all of those books.
Exactly.
And I created various things to obscure that, even in my own heart. But no, by the time, funnily enough, I wrote Courting the Wild Twin in 5 days.
Wow.
It's a very quick book. I mean, my book, Scatterlings, the last one of the few books before it took 5 years. I'm used to long labors, but something about Wild Twin was a thoroughly masticated wisdom. I chewed on it for so long. It comes out, and there's this kind of efficiency to that book, as there is the book after it, Smoke Hole. There's something very, very compact. I always say to people, if you want a gateway drug to what I'm about, read those 2 books. You'll either like it or you won't.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I think that the Wild Twin, I mean, the thing that led to my sort of dawning to consciousness of Christianity was a 101-day vigil that I did in a forest. And I went into the forest fundamentally anticipating being wedded to the wild, of which I already have plenty of experience. And I came out wedded to Christ. And my Christian time of the last 2 years has been realizing that those 2 weddings face each other.
Yes.
They face each other. They're in accord with each other. And I don't have time to unpack what I'm about to say here. But for me, Christianity is the big shamanism that I've been looking for my whole life. I just didn't understand the crucifixion, which has always been something that I found kind of grotesque from a certain point of view. And then of course I realized that it was, the supreme poetic act. It's the most shamanic thing that I've ever seen. Talk about the wounded healer. This is it writ large. And then suddenly so much emotion came into me. And also this detail that his mother is fucking watching.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
His mother is watching.
Yeah.
Where are the disciples at that point, bar John? It's the women. The women are there. The women travel distance, and they see it down. They see down the one catastrophe that no parent should ever see. Despite all the enormous cosmological implications of what is going on at that moment, that is a mum and her son also.
Yeah.
And
it's
so
also,
for a long for a long time, I don't know what it's like for you, but there was a long time that I couldn't really be in public and talk about this stuff, because actually for the first 8 months after really coming out of the wood and realizing that the spiritual situation I was in, I went through a kind of spiritual audit that I can't really explain. It was as if every room in me was being thoroughly looked at. And that meant that if I tried to talk about it, mid-evening, that an event I was giving, I'd be very, very near to tears the whole time.
You're right.
Do you remember the scene? There's that scene where, just leading up towards Gethsemane and the crucifixion and everything. There's a woman that, she cleans his feet in the expensive oils and everything. And one of the disciples says, what a terrific waste of money.
Judas said that.
He says, yeah. Always got his eye on the purse. He says, don't you realize she's already preparing the corpse? She's already washing the dead. I couldn't talk about things like that a year ago. It was too appropriately derailing.
Yeah. Well, I made a bunch of notes before this, and I'm like I said, I'm a little scatterbrained, but I just kind of go with the flow, like what comes to my mind. And one of the things that I had to realize and I didn't actually grow up a Christian. Like my parents weren't Christians until I was 14. And then they became Christians. And then then we were all, going to church suddenly. And I didn't like that too much, actually, at the time. But I had a very mystical experience as a 5-year-old in which I just knew that there was an afterlife. I knew that God was real, and I knew that he loved me. And so I suppose I always was a Christian, but I had to walk into it, into the fullness of that at some point, right? But one of the things, as a, having been a Protestant Christian, that I had to understand was the Theotokos. And so I, instead of trying to propositionally understand the Theotokos, I thought, no, I'm just going to participate, and I want the Theotokos to reveal herself to me, right? Who she is, what she represents. And one of the things, because there are many, many things, many layers, but one of the things was that I realized was that she is the cosmos, the earth, the stuff of me, right? She's the humanity of Christ. And I had this image in my head of the umbilical cord. And I was like, oh my goodness, she's tethering us to the earth. And one of the things that always bothered me about Christianity was this inclination to lean more towards heaven and away from the earth. And I felt like everything, all the destructiveness that we see on Mother Nature, let's say, is a result of this Gnosticism, of this, that the earth is cursed and we have to dominate it. And, because I've never seen the earth that way, I've always seen it as something that groans and waits, right? All creation groans and waits. It's in the process of it. It knows more than I do. It's actually waiting for something. And that something is for me to realize what this story is, right? We went through this book here. It's by an anthroposophic author. Emil Book. His name is. Whoops. It's called The Apocalypse of St. John. It's about the book of Revelation. And I just feel like I should read you this. I saved it this morning. He's going through the 7 letters in the book of Revelation, and the first one is to Ephesus. The mysterious subject of love is introduced explicitly in the first and last message. The church of Ephesus is told, quote, I have this against thee, that thou hast forsaken thy first love. What is first love? We cannot attain to the last love, to the earthly goal, so long as we belong to those who have even forsaken the first love. Such apocalyptic formula as that of the first love should not be taken too humanly. The first love is the love which animates children. The spirit and soul of a human being would not descend to earth at birth if they were not led to do so by love of the earth. Only afterwards we forget why we come down into incarnation. But the joyous surrender of a child to all that is earthly is the echo of prenatal love for the earth. Love for the earth is the meaning of the apocalyptic expression, the first love. It lies hidden in the depths of our own being. In the course of life, we fall all too easily into the temptation to look back longingly to heaven, and hence to be disloyal to the earth. The cultivation of this first love forms the first steps on the path to Philadelphia, which is brotherly love, right? And I remember when we were going through this book, and I did that with Nate on the Grail Country channel. I was thrilled to see that, and it came back to me when I was trying to understand the Theotokos and participating in what was really interesting was that the only liturgy I ever participated in the very beginning was the Matins liturgy, because I was COVID. The priest just did a Matins for a whole year every Sunday, and Matins is Theotokos centric. So So here I wanted to know her, and I just happened to be steeped in matins for a whole year, every Sunday. And I realized, I had that image of the umbilical cord and the tethering to, Christ and the Theotokos tied together literally by a cord, right? And I was like, this is heaven and earth. This is what this is. So I'm a very big proponent, I suppose, of the sacred image that the cosmos is to us. I want people to understand that it is, I don't know how to put this. There's a journey that we need. There seems just to be, like he says here, we've lost our first love. And in having lost that love, we have obscured the image of God in the world, because this world is creation and it expresses him, and it's his image that we see. If we want to love it, we have to love it, right? Which just to me means to be in relationship with it.
Yeah. Something I've said, I wrote a book, the book after Wild Twin. I wrote it for my daughter because she was turning 16 at the time. And one of the things it says in the book is we make things holy by the kind of attention we give them.
Yes.
And I'm always aware I'm preparing to travel at the moment, and my attention on my daughter is qualitatively not quite as good as it could be. Because half the mind is for train tickets, plane tickets, right, cars, all of this stuff. We make things solely by the kind of attention we give them. Now, that was a real thought in my head, but of course, over the centuries, there's a million different ways that's already been said. But it is something for me that's very real. The notion how I think an awful lot of people view Christianity as effectively, it's rather urban.
Yeah.
It's a kind of urban, slightly citified phenomena now that's taking its cues from a society that doesn't even really care for it anymore. I mean, what we have in England is a very interesting thing going on where, on the one hand, we are culturally, we're in terms of civic duty, we're more Christian than ever. A lot of very, very good things anchored in Christian theology are now writ large and functioning beautifully in England, but it's all on a horizontal level,
right? And
people get pretty uncomfortable, with the only exception, oddly, being recently the crowning of the king. That's the only time when anything vertical is really overtly referred to, especially Christian, because people would rather almost anything but actually, yeah, I'm a Christian. So it's odd. I don't buy the line that we're all Christian, we don't just know it. I don't believe that, because I think I know what a Christian smells like. I know what they feel like. I know a lot of people that are Christian but would never consciously use the word. Yes. It's a thing. It's an animal thing, and know when it's present. And I'm sorry, but it's to do with love. It's to do with love. It's to do with the last being first. It's to do with all that really difficult stuff.
Yeah.
But that's where we are. Is that, yes, on a secular kind of level, we still function with Christian values, and that's great. But I think Christianity has forgotten that it's a dream. It's forgotten that it's a dream. Yeah. And what I mean by that, and this goes back to C.S. Lewis, and this will certainly, I think, is really my work, my tiny bit of work around, Christianity now, is that Lewis said, Christianity is a combination of what he called the big pictures of the pagans and the road of the Jewish people.
Right.
And Christ wanted us to have a road. There's something that happens to our feet once we've got something we can walk upon. But every few hundred years, Mother Kirk, which is Lewis's description of the church,
Right.
it starts to crumble. And when it starts to crumble, the landlord sends the big pictures again, sends the big pictures. And I think we're in a time, I wouldn't call what Lewis calls pictures, I would call dreams.
Right.
And I think Christianity needs to remember its dreaming, because I'm worried that the road has become a super lane highway and the dream has become a hallucination.
Yeah. Well, that's a good analogy. Yeah. Yeah. And the super lane highway is, people are traveling so fast, they don't even know what they're looking at, you know, like they're just missing everything just by nature of the speed at which they travel.
If you probably know it, but have you ever come across a book called The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram?
No.
It's a book in other areas of my life. It's a book that's so well known. It's absolutely, you know, seminal. But I would recommend, I'd recommend everybody, if you haven't come across it, The Spell of the Sensuous is really about the spell making of the alphabet, what happened when we started to write things down.
Okay.
It's not a book that is anti-literacy. It just brings you into a profound understanding of the power of language when, you know, it moves from cuneiform tablet and onwards.
Yeah.
I don't know why that suddenly jumps into my head, but it's a book that we should read. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, go to Ivan Illich's book, Inside the Vineyard of the Text, or In the Vineyard of the Text, which talks about what happens when we move from orality to literacy, which is something that, you know, a lot of the time is going on in monastic setups.
Yeah.
But I'm about to, as I said, I'm about to go on tour for 3 weeks, and I will not let myself bring anything serious in the way of notes.
Yeah.
You know, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I can't do that. It's going to get in the way. If you're looking for sentences that never have bumps and stops and weird twists and turns, then this is a dangerous route to go. But as William Blake says, you know, straight roads are boring, and the roads without improvement that are crooked are roads of genius.
Right.
You know.
Right.
So that's how I feel. Anyway, I've never met Jesus on a motorway.
Yeah. No.
I've only met him in strange, gloaming places.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, that's right. I guess that's why I was a little nervous about this. I'm just realizing now, a little nervous about this conversation, because I want to talk about something that I don't have words for. Right. And I almost don't, at the same time, don't want to make it explicit at the risk of it slipping. I call these experiences slippery fish. You know, you see them and you grab for them, but then they're gone, right? You can't hold them. You can't grasp them. They're not yours to have. And they kind of work like little lights that light the way, you know. And they're not entirely like, they're not complicated. But they're really hard to describe. And I find sometimes when I do have to explain something, it sounds simple and obvious, right? And this is, I think this gets to this first love quote that I read, was that it's the love that a child has, right? And Jesus even says this. He says that in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, you have to become like a little child. And I feel like I want to tell you this dream. I don't know how much time you have, Martin, but just cut me off when you want to go. I had a dream that, and this was fairly recently, actually, that there was a threat. And okay, so the setting was a mall, and it was an empty mall. And I knew people were living in that mall, and this threat entered the mall, and I knew that there was a small child in a room downstairs, and I had to go save her. And I went down and I picked her up, and she was like maybe 4 years old. She was wearing a little white nightie, and I could feel the warmth and the softness of her skin. And I carried her in front of me, and with her legs dangling like a seat. And then I went up these stairs, and I was kind of hiding from this threat that was in the mall. And I came up to a landing, and there was another. There was a bedroom there on the landing, and there was two young girls. One was 12 or 13, the other was like 17 or 18. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know this was your bedroom, and I'm just passing through." And I went around, and I went up another set of stairs, and I came to another bedroom, and there was an old woman in a bed. And I looked at her, and she smiled at me. She was sitting up in her bed, leaning against the wall. And there was a mirror on the wall. And in the mirror, I could see her reflection. As I looked at her in the mirror, I could see her transforming. So she became a lion, and then she became a young woman, and then she became a middle-aged woman, and then, and then she became an ape. She had an ape face, and if I looked at her, she didn't transform. Only in the mirror did she transform. And I said to her, "Who are you?" And then she just smiled at me. And I was like, "Oh my goodness, she's me." And I was carrying the child in me. And I passed through my, teen years, right? And what the thing that made me the happiest about that dream was that I saved the child. It was the child that I wanted to save more than anything. And I could feel her body against my own, And I think this is the beauty of stories, because what it does is it wakes the child in us, for one thing, the child that we need to keep alive. And that first love is also awakened, through that child, right? That experience of the child. And as Jesus says, we enter the kingdom of heaven as little children, right? And I don't know, I think maybe everything that we've been talking about is kind of coming together in that image.
Incredible dream. It's amazing, isn't it? I wrote actually somewhere recently that dreaming is a kind of otherworld thinking. Like it's an extraordinary form of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And the wonderful thing about a dream is it can't really be corralled. It can't be contained. It can't be made nice. People have erotic dreams where they're doing extreme things with people that in normal life they'd have nothing to do with. It exposes all kinds of things.
It does.
It brings it up to the surface. And that dream is phenomenal. That's a big dream, capital B, capital D,
Yeah. It was a big dream. Yeah. And I have to say that all of my life has actually been led by dreams. Whenever I had a big question to God about anything, it was, I had a dream and then I would move forward. It was like, they were like stepping stones for me. Yeah.
Well, in terms of children, I have to go and make some supper in a minute for my child.
All right.
Is there anything, in these last few minutes, anything that you were particularly thinking about?
Yeah, I have way too many things I'm thinking about, Martin. I could talk to you for a long time. Maybe one day we'll have the opportunity. I've been thinking a lot about imagination, but there's too much to talk about there. But I'll just let you know that I've been going through with some friends an essay by George MacDonald called The Imagination, Its Function and Culture. And really appreciating his take on it, and learning that I think, well, I believe that we really are suffering from a lack of imagination. And I appreciate what you're doing in order to spark that again for people, because I think it's simple, but it's very profound at the same time. It's carrying that little child, right? And it is in being like a little child that we enter the kingdom of heaven. So thank you for that.
Pleasure. Good. That feels like a good place to bring this to an end.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, and wish you all the best on all your upcoming events.
Thank you very much. And yes, give me a sense of when this goes out. I'm sure there'll be plenty of friends of mine that would love to see it and find it very. So send me a link and I'll let people know.